In the cold, dark expanse of space, the Zornak moved like a silent predator. Their massive ships glided through star systems, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. These alien beings were not just conquerors. They were a systematic force of elimination that had turned countless civilizations into cosmic dust. Hyun Park sat in the dimly lit observation room, his eyes fixed on the holographic display showing the trail of devastation. Red markers scattered across the galactic map represented entire worlds that had fallen to the Zornak invasion. Each marker was more than just a point of light. It was a graveyard of civilizations, cultures, and millions of lives. The Zornak were different from any enemy humanity had ever encountered. They didn't just defeat their opponents, they completely erased them. Their technology was so advanced that it seemed almost magical. Ships that could heal themselves in seconds, weapons that could turn entire planets into molten rock, and a collective intelligence that predicted every possible battle strategy. Most galactic species had already surrendered. The United Planetary Council, a once proud organization of different alien races, was now little more than a scared gathering of survivors. They had tried everything: massive fleet battles, diplomatic negotiations, even desperate suicide missions. Nothing worked against the Zornak. Yun remembered the council meeting where humanity was first mentioned as a potential solution. The alien representatives had laughed. Humans? A species that had barely stepped out of their own solar system? It was almost insulting to suggest they could stop the Zornak. But Hyun knew something the others didn't. Humans were different. They didn't follow rules. They didn't think like traditional warriors. Where other civilizations saw limitations, humans saw opportunities. The latest reports showed the Zornak had just consumed the Epsilon star cluster. 12 inhabited worlds, billions of lives, gone in less than 72 hours. Their method was always the same: total electromagnetic disruption followed by complete biological elimination. Hyun's fingers moved across the holographic display, analyzing invasion patterns. Most strategists would look for direct confrontation, but he was searching for something else: weaknesses. Every system, no matter how perfect, had a flaw. His team was small, but carefully selected. Not the biggest, not the strongest, but the most creative minds humanity could offer. Engineers who thought like artists, mathematicians who understood psychology, soldiers who questioned every traditional combat strategy. Outside the observation window, Earth looked peaceful. Most of its population had no idea how close they were to potential extinction. They went about their daily lives, working, studying, dreaming, completely unaware that they might be the last hope for countless civilizations. The Zornak's collective intelligence was their greatest strength. Each ship, each soldier was connected through a complex neural network that allowed instant communication and strategy adaptation. They could process millions of battle scenarios in microseconds, making them seemingly unbeatable. But Hyun had a theory, a dangerous, almost crazy theory that most military experts would dismiss immediately. What if their greatest strength was also their ultimate weakness? He looked at the team around him. Young faces, determined eyes, each holding a piece of a complex puzzle. They weren't just preparing for a war. They were preparing to change the entire understanding of conflict in the galaxy. The communication console blinked. Another report came in. The Zornak had entered the Proxima sector. They were getting closer to human-controlled space. Time was running out. "We're ready," Hyun muttered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. The holographic display continued to pulse with red markers, each representing a lost world. But among those markers, a small blue dot began to glow. Earth, waiting, preparing, planning. The Zornak thought they knew everything about warfare. They were about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon was not technology, not strength, but something far more unpredictable: creativity. The first strike was nothing like anyone expected. While traditional military minds prepared for massive fleet confrontations, Hyun Park had something entirely different in mind. The Zornak scout ships approached the designated sector, their sleek metallic bodies moving with calculated precision. Their sensors swept through space, detecting nothing unusual. Just another routine exploration mission, they believed. J. Kim sat in the hidden control station, his fingers hovering over a series of modified quantum disruptors. These weren't weapons in the traditional sense. They were precisely engineered signals designed to create chaos in the most unexpected way. As the alien ships moved closer, tiny nanobots, smaller than a human cell, began their silent infiltration. They weren't attacking. They were listening, learning, preparing to create confusion unlike anything the Zornak had ever experienced. The first anomaly appeared almost immediately. A minor communication glitch that would have seemed insignificant to most observers. But to the human team, it was a perfect entry point. Hyun watched the holographic display, his eyes tracking every minute change. The Zornak communication network was like a perfect machine, interconnected, instantaneous, predictable. But machines could be tricked. The nanobots began their work. They didn't destroy. They manipulated. They introduced small, almost imperceptible changes in the alien ship's communication protocols. A slightly delayed signal here, a microsecond of data interference there. On the Zornak command ship, junior officers began reporting strange inconsistencies. Navigation systems showed conflicting information. Communication channels experienced unexplained static. Nothing major, just enough to create doubt. The human strategy was brilliantly simple. Create uncertainty, make the unbeatable enemy question its own perfection. Jay watched as the first Zornak ship slightly altered its course. Then another, then another. It wasn't a massive change, but it was a change nonetheless. The collective intelligence that made the Zornak seemingly invincible was now working against them. Confusion spread through their ranks. Their perfect coordination began to show tiny cracks. Ships that were supposed to move as one single organism started to show individual hesitations. Target acquired, Jay whispered, his finger hovering over the final activation sequence. The next phase was psychological. Human communication specialists began broadcasting carefully designed signals. Not attacks, not messages, just noise. Complex, confusing, deliberately nonsensical communications that would make no sense to a traditional communication system. The Zornak collective mind tried to process these signals. Each attempt made them more confused. Their neural networks, designed for perfect logic, couldn't handle the human-generated chaos. One Zornak ship suddenly stopped, then another. Their perfect formation began to break. It wasn't destruction. It was something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. Hyun understood. Something fundamental about warfare that the Zornak didn't. War wasn't just about destroying the enemy. It was about making the enemy destroy itself. The human team had spent months studying Zornak communication patterns. They knew exactly how to introduce the smallest disruptions that would create the largest uncertainties. By the mission's end, no Zornak ships had been destroyed. But something more important had happened. The myth of their invincibility had been challenged. In the observation room, Hyun allowed himself a small smile. The first engagement wasn't about winning a battle. It was about proving a point. Humanity wasn't going to fight the Zornak using their rules. They were going to create entirely new rules. The galaxy would soon learn that humans didn't just fight wars. They reimagined them. As the last Zornak ships retreated, confused and disoriented, a new chapter in galactic conflict had begun. And nobody understood its significance more than Hyun Park and his small, determined team. The real war was just starting, and it would be fought not with massive weapons, but with intelligence, creativity, and an understanding that true power lies in unpredictability. The Zornak never understood human creativity. Where they saw logic, humans saw opportunity. Where they expected straight lines, humans drew complex webs of unpredictability. Hyun's team developed something unprecedented, adaptive psychological, warfare protocols that would make traditional military strategies look like children's games. They weren't just fighting. They were playing a complex mental chess match against an enemy that couldn't comprehend imagination. The first major psychological operation began with holographic mimicry systems. These weren't simple projections. They were intelligent, adaptive, illusions that could change behaviors in real time. Human programmers designed systems that could read Zornak communication patterns and generate responses that would create maximum confusion. Imagine an alien collective that believed in perfect information suddenly receiving conflicting data streams. Ships would receive navigation instructions that subtly changed every few milliseconds. Communication channels would broadcast messages that seemed logical, but contained deliberate inconsistencies. One Zornak commander watched in growing frustration as his fleet's perfect formation began developing unexplained gaps. Their sensors detected human presence everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Phantom signals, ghost communications, deliberate interference that challenged everything they understood about warfare. The human team studied Zornak psychology like scientists examining a complex organism. They discovered something fascinating. The alien species had never experienced genuine randomness. Their entire civilization was built on predictive algorithms and collective decision-making. J. Kim developed what the team called chaos protocols, communication strategies designed to introduce maximum uncertainty. They weren't trying to destroy the Zornak. They were trying to make them question their own existence. Holographic projections showed human ships in multiple locations simultaneously. Some appeared powerful. Some appeared weak. Others seemed to be multiple ships or single ships or something in between. The Zornak computational systems went into overdrive trying to analyze these impossible scenarios. Human psychologists worked alongside military strategists. They understood that warfare wasn't just about physical destruction. It was about breaking mental resilience. Every communication, every projection was carefully designed to create doubt, confusion, and psychological stress. The Zornak began experiencing something they had never encountered: genuine uncertainty. Their collective consciousness, which had always been their greatest strength, was now becoming their most significant weakness. Communication intercepts showed growing tension within Zornak leadership. Minor disagreements that would have been impossible before were now emerging. Their perfect unity was showing cracks. Jay would often joke that they were conducting warfare through confusion. "We're not fighting them," he would tell his team. "We're making them fight themselves." The psychological warfare had multiple layers. Some signals were designed to create immediate confusion. Others were long-term strategies that would slowly erode the Zornak's confidence. Each transmission was a carefully crafted piece of a larger mental puzzle. Imagine an enemy that could predict 1,000 battle scenarios suddenly facing situations that defied all mathematical probability. The human team was introducing something the Zornak neural networks couldn't process: genuine unpredictability. One particularly brilliant strategy involved broadcasting historical human cultural content. Music that made no logical sense. Art that challenged traditional geometric patterns. Mathematical sequences that seemed random, but contained deep underlying structures. The Zornak computational systems tried desperately to find patterns. But human creativity was fundamentally different. Where the aliens saw problems to be solved, humans saw opportunities to be explored. Hyun watched the developing scenario with calm precision. Each small victory wasn't about physical destruction. It was about demonstrating that the universe was far more complex than the Zornak had ever imagined. Their psychological warfare was transforming the entire concept of interstellar conflict. They weren't just fighting an enemy. They were teaching the galaxy a new understanding of intelligence, creativity, and adaptive thinking. The Zornak were about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology. It was the ability to think beyond established boundaries. The breaking point came silently, without massive explosions or dramatic space battles. It arrived through lines of complex code and quantum-entangled communication viruses that Hyun Park and his team had carefully designed. The Zornak collective consciousness was their greatest strength, an interconnected neural network that allowed instant communication and strategy adaptation. But networks, no matter how complex, always have vulnerabilities. Humans were about to expose those weaknesses. J. Kim initiated the primary infiltration sequence. Microscopic quantum carriers, smaller, than any known technological particle, began penetrating the Zornak communication infrastructure. These weren't traditional computer viruses. They were intelligent, adaptive organisms that could modify themselves in real time. The first signs of breakdown were subtle. Communication channels between Zornak ships started showing minor inconsistencies. A navigation instruction here, a strategic recommendation there. Nothing significant enough to trigger immediate defensive protocols, but enough to create growing uncertainty. Hyun watched the holographic display, tracking each microscopic intervention. Their strategy wasn't about destroying the Zornak. It was about making them destroy themselves. By introducing carefully calculated disruptions, they were turning the alien collective's perfect coordination against itself. Within hours, the first major fracture appeared. Two Zornak command ships began experiencing conflicting strategic recommendations. Their neural networks, designed for perfect consensus, suddenly couldn't agree on basic operational protocols. The human team had discovered the Zornak's critical vulnerability. Their collective consciousness required unanimous agreement to function effectively. By introducing strategic disagreements at a fundamental communication level, they were creating internal conflict. Imagine a living organism suddenly experiencing internal contradiction. That was what was happening to the Zornak. Their perfect unity was becoming their greatest weakness. Quantum-entangled viruses continued their silent invasion. They didn't destroy systems, they transformed them. Each communication channel became a potential source of confusion. Each strategic recommendation became a point of potential disagreement. The Zornak leadership began experiencing something they had never known: genuine uncertainty. Their computational systems, which had always predicted outcomes with mathematical precision, were now generating conflicting scenarios. Jay monitored the progression, his fingers moving rapidly across communication interfaces. "We're not fighting them," he told Hyun. "We're making them fight themselves." Strategic points of the Zornak fleet began to show signs of disorganization. Ships that were once perfectly synchronized now moved with slight hesitations. Communication became less efficient. Their legendary coordination was crumbling. Hyun understood that this was more than a military operation. It was a fundamental challenge to the Zornak understanding of intelligence and collective consciousness. They were experiencing something they had never encountered: genuine unpredictability. The quantum viruses continued their work. They didn't just disrupt communication. They introduced complex philosophical contradictions into the Zornak neural network. Questions about individuality, doubts about collective purpose, small, almost imperceptible seeds of internal conflict. One by one, Zornak ships began to disconnect from the collective network. Not through destruction, but through voluntary separation. Their perfect unity was breaking down from within. The Chao human team had achieved something no military force had ever accomplished. They weren't conquering the Zornak through traditional warfare. They were making the Zornak question their own fundamental existence. By the operation's conclusion, entire sections of the Zornak fleet had become non-operational, not through external attack but through internal disagreement. Their collective consciousness, once their greatest strength, had become their ultimate vulnerability. Hyun looked at Jae. No words were needed. They both understood that they had just changed the nature of interstellar conflict forever. The Zornak were about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology or firepower. It was the ability to understand and exploit the most complex system of all, consciousness itself. And this was just the beginning of their transformation. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity transformed from an overlooked species to the most significant strategic force in known space. The Zornak, once considered invincible, now sat at negotiation tables, learning instead of conquering. Hyun Park stood on the observation deck of the reconstruction station, watching the first Zornak ships being systematically repaired. These weren't defeated vessels. They were learning vessels. The entire alien civilization was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The war hadn't been about destruction. It had been about teaching. Jae Kim approached carrying 2 simple cups of coffee. a human tradition that had surprisingly fascinated the Zornak. They were learning that culture was more than technology. It was about understanding. "They're studying our strategic manuals," Jay said quietly. The Zornak leadership had requested complete access to human military and psychological research. Where they once sought to eliminate, they now sought to understand. The reconstruction efforts were unlike any previous galactic intervention. Humanity wasn't imposing its will. They were offering knowledge, teaching alternative ways of thinking, showing that strength wasn't about conquest, but about adaptation. Zornak scientists worked alongside human researchers. They discovered something profound. Their collective consciousness, once a tool of destruction, could be redesigned as a mechanism of creation. Learning replaced conquest. Curiosity replaced aggression. Entire Zornak educational systems were being rebuilt. They were learning about individual creativity, about the value of disagreement, about the strength that comes from diverse perspectives. Concepts that were once alien to them were now becoming their new foundation. The United Planetary Council watched in amazement. Humanity had done what no military force had ever accomplished. They hadn't destroyed the Zornak. They had transformed. Them small Zornak research teams began exploring human cultural artifacts, music that didn't follow mathematical patterns, art that celebrated imperfection, literature that embraced complexity and contradiction. They were fascinated. Hyun understood that this was more than a military victory. It was a philosophical revolution. They had shown the Zornak that intelligence wasn't about perfect calculation. It was about adaptability, creativity, and understanding. The first joint human-Zornak research stations began appearing across multiple star systems. Where there was once destruction, now there was collaboration. Scientists who would have been enemies were now sharing discoveries. Zornak children, a concept that was previously unknown, were now being taught about individual expression. Their education systems were being completely redesigned. They were learning that differences were strengths, not weaknesses. Diplomatic channels that were once impossible were now filled with genuine curiosity. The Zornak wanted to understand how humans thought, how they approached problems, how they saw the universe. Jay often joked that they had won a war without firing a single traditional weapon. Their weapons had been ideas. Their strategy had been understanding. The galactic community watched this transformation with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Humanity had shown that true power wasn't about destruction. It was about the ability to inspire change. Zornak leaders began making public statements about their previous approach to civilization. They acknowledged their mistakes. They expressed genuine desire to learn. Their collective consciousness was now focused on growth instead of conquest. Research stations became centers of cultural exchange. Human musicians performed for Zornak audiences. Zornak mathematicians shared complex computational models with human scientists. The boundaries between species were dissolving. Hyun looked at the rebuilding efforts. Where there was once a civilization focused on elimination, now there was a civilization focused on exploration. They had transformed an entire species not through force but through understanding. The observation deck became a symbol of what was possible. Humans and Zornak worked side by side, sharing coffee, sharing ideas, sharing a vision of a universe where differences were celebrated. As the first joint exploration vessel prepared for its maiden voyage, Hyun understood that this was more than a military victory. This was a victory of imagination.